There is a building being planned right now that makes the Burj Khalifa look like a parking garage. And we are not talking about a few extra floors, or a record by a slim margin. We are talking about a building twice as tall as anything ever constructed in human history, 2,000 meters, 678 floors. A structure so extreme that the engineers designing it had to invent solutions to problems that have never existed before. Saudi Arabia is building it. They say it will be finished by 2030, and as of right now, they have not broken a single meter of ground. What is actually going on here? And is this a building or something else entirely? In 2024, Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, the sovereign wealth fund that controls over $700 billion in assets, unveiled a project unlike anything ever seriously proposed at this scale. The Rise Tower, 2,000 meters tall, 678 floors, located inside a brand new city called the North Pole District, a planned urban development spanning 306 square kilometers on the Red Sea coast near Jeddah. Designed by Foster Plus Partners, the firm behind Apple Park and the Reichstag Dome in Berlin, alongside HKS Architects, budget announced at $5 billion. To put that in perspective, the Burj Khalifa cost $1.5 billion. The One World Trade Center cost $3.9 billion. The Rise Tower, at $5 billion, would need to be built in one of the most logistically challenging environments on Earth, in coastal desert, extreme heat, with no existing urban infrastructure. And the target completion date is 2030, 6 years, for a building twice the height of anything ever constructed in human history. What separates this announcement from every other world's tallest claim that has come before it is a single fact. The Rise Tower won the 2025 WAFCAX Prize for Climate and Energy Innovation, one of the most respected awards in global architecture. This is not a render on a napkin. The world's most serious architectural critics reviewed this design and called it a legitimate breakthrough. But the question nobody in the press was asking loudly enough went unspoken. Why now? Saudi Arabia already has the Jeddah Tower, a 1,000-meter skyscraper that broke ground in 2013 and is still not finished. Why announce something twice as ambitious when the previous record attempt is still sitting, half-built, on the other side of the same city? That question is where this story actually begins. Let's talk about what it actually takes to build something 2,000 meters tall. Because the moment you get past 500 meters, almost every rule of conventional engineering breaks. Elevators are the first problem. Every elevator you have ever ridden in your life uses steel cables. Those cables run from the cab up to a motor at the top. They work perfectly at 400, 500, even 600 meters. But at 2,000 meters, steel cables snap under their own weight. The cable for a single elevator in the Rise Tower would weigh so much it would require more energy to lift itself than to lift the passengers inside it. So the engineers working on this project turned to two solutions. The first is magnetic levitation elevators, the same technology used in high-speed trains in Japan and China, applied vertically inside a building. The second is a material called ultra rope, developed by Cone, one of the world's largest elevator companies. Carbon fiber-based, 1/7 the weight of steel, strong enough to span the full height of the tower. This is not science fiction. Ultra rope is already being used in the Jeddah Tower, but the Rise Tower would push it to a scale that has never been attempted. Now wind. At 2,000 meters above sea level, wind speeds reach 200 to 250 kilometers per hour. But it is not just the speed that is the problem. It is something called vortex shedding. When wind hits a cylindrical structure, it separates on either side and creates rotating vortices, spinning pockets of air, that alternately push the building left and right. At lower heights, this is manageable. At 2,000 meters, these vortices can push a building back and forth with forces equivalent to a moderate earthquake, repeatedly, every day. The Rise Tower's tapered design, narrower at the top than at the base, is specifically engineered to disrupt vortex formation before it becomes synchronized. The shape itself is the solution. But there is something nobody in the press coverage mentioned. The top 400 meters of this building will be inside the cloud layer above Jeddah for significant portions of the year. The mechanical systems, the glass, the structural joints, all of them will be exposed to sustained moisture, freezing temperatures at night, and intense ultraviolet radiation by day. That is not a solved problem. That is an active engineering frontier. Some of the best structural engineers in the world have publicly said they believe the building is feasible. A smaller number have quietly said it depends entirely on whether solutions that work in theory actually translate at this scale. Keep that in mind while watching the rest of this video. The firms that submitted bids for the Rise Tower's construction include AECOM, Bechtel, Jacobs, Parsons, Turner, and Mace. These are not fringe companies. These are the firms that built the world's ports, airports, and power grids. When they submit bids, they believe the project can be executed. So the real question has never been whether this can be built. The real question is why it needs to be built at all. Before we go any further, we need to give the skeptics their moment. Because the skeptics' case is not weak. The Jeddah Tower was announced in 2011. Construction began in 2013. The plan was to finish by 2020. It is now 2026. The tower is still not finished. Work has been paused multiple times, most recently for years, due to contractor disputes, financing problems, and the arrest of several Saudi billionaires during the 2017 anti-corruption purge. That is 1 kilometer of building, 13 years of construction, and it is still not done. Then there is NEOM's The Line, the 170-kilometer mirrored city announced with extraordinary fanfare in 2020. As of 2025, plans have been scaled back significantly, with reports indicating the initial phase will be a tiny fraction of the original vision. And the Muqab, the 400-meter cube announced for Riyadh in 2023, has had no major construction updates since its debut render went viral. The pattern the skeptic sees is consistent. A Saudi Arabia that announces megaprojects at a pace faster than any nation in history, collects the global headlines, then quietly scales back when the cameras move on. And they have a point. If the Jeddah Tower at 1 kilometer has taken 13 years and counting, what does a 6-year target for something twice that size actually mean? The counter-argument, though, is worth sitting with. Saudi Arabia in 2013 was a different country than Saudi Arabia in 2024. The old model was built on oil revenue and royal patronage. The new model, under Vision 2030 and the Public Investment Fund, involves institutional capital, international partnerships, and sovereign wealth fund governance. The bidders on the Rise Tower are not friends of the crown. They are international engineering firms with contractual obligations and reputational stakes. That is not the same situation as 2013. Now we get to what this building is actually about. The Rise Tower is not a tourism project. It is not primarily a real estate development. And despite what the press releases say, it is not mainly about engineering innovation. It is a message. And Saudi Arabia is writing it in steel, glass, and 678 floors visible from space. Let's lay out the context. Saudi Arabia has built its entire economy on oil for the past 70 years. At peak, oil revenues funded roughly 70% of the Saudi government's budget. The country built hospitals, universities, and a social welfare system almost entirely on petrodollars. But the global energy transition is accelerating. Electric vehicles, renewable energy, and pressure from Western governments to decarbonize mean that peak oil demand may be closer than anyone in Riyadh expected. Vision 2030. The reform plan championed by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is Saudi Arabia's response to that threat. The plan is to diversify the economy, build tourism, attract foreign investment, create a domestic entertainment industry, and turn the country into something that can survive in a world that no longer needs as much oil. The Rise Tower is the most visible expression of that transformation. A 2,000-meter building says something no diplomatic speech can convey. We are not a petrostate waiting to fade. We are a civilization making its next move. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Some analysts who study Gulf state strategy have pointed out something that rarely makes the architecture press. The announcement of megaprojects at this scale is not just economic signaling, it is also strategic misdirection. When a country announces a $5 billion building that will take the better part of a decade, international attention focuses on that building. Journalists write about it, YouTube channels make documentaries about it. And while everyone is looking at the skyscraper, the real work of economic transformation quietly happens in the background. Regulatory reform, banking law changes, sovereign wealth fund restructuring. Some say the megaprojects are as much about controlling the narrative as building cities. A 2,000-meter tower guarantees that the world's conversation about Saudi Arabia is not about oil dependence or human rights concerns. It is about engineering and ambition. That is not a conspiracy. That is how geopolitics has always worked. But even that theory does not fully explain the scale. The Line, the Muqab, the North Pole District, the Rise Tower. Saudi Arabia is not building one landmark. It is building an entirely new layer of civilization, which makes you wonder what they know about the next 50 years that the rest of the world does not. What do you think? Leave your prediction in the comments below. We will come back to this at the end. The Rise Tower does not stand alone. It is the centerpiece of something far larger, the North Pole District, 306 square kilometers of planned urban development. For reference, the entire island of Manhattan is 59 square kilometers. The North Pole District is 5 times larger. The master plan includes residential districts, financial zones, cultural institutions, a marina, and transport links designed to connect it to Jeddah's existing infrastructure. The Rise Tower is designed as the economic and symbolic anchor of the entire project. What the renders show is a city designed for a post-oil world. Low-carbon transit, mixed-use zoning, waterfront development calibrated for tourism rather than industry. The ambition is real, the land exists, and the ownership is clear. The Public Investment Fund controls all of it. What does not yet exist is a single meter of foundation. The detail that does not get enough attention is simpler than it sounds. The North Pole District, like the Line, like the Muqab, exists almost entirely in the space between render and reality. Saudi Arabia has announced more planned urban development in the last 5 years than most nations build in 50. At some point, the question stops being can they build it and becomes something more uncomfortable. Who is going to live there? The Rise Tower won the 2025 WAFC's Prize for Climate and Energy Innovation. That is not a consolation prize. That is recognition from the global architectural community that the building's design represents a serious contribution to sustainable construction. The design integrates vertical wind turbines at the upper floors, passive solar shading systems embedded in the facade, and rainwater harvesting engineered to operate in one of the driest climates on Earth. The claim is that the building will generate a meaningful portion of its own energy needs from its exposure to wind and sun. At 2,000 meters, where wind speeds are consistently high and sunlight is intense, that claim is more plausible than it sounds. But the contradiction at the center of this story is worth pausing on. Saudi Arabia is one of the largest oil producers in the world. Saudi Aramco is simultaneously funding domestic clean energy projects under the PIF, while continuing to pump crude oil at record volumes. A building that wins a climate prize, funded by a sovereign wealth fund supported by oil revenues, in a country still expanding fossil fuel production. Some call that hypocrisy, others call it hedging. A few analysts have suggested it is the most sophisticated form of rebranding in modern geopolitical history. What if a climate prize is not evidence of transformation, but cover for it? Let's talk about failure. Not because failure is likely, but because the consequences of failure at this scale are worth understanding. If the Rise Tower follows the Jeddah Tower trajectory, breaks ground, runs into financing problems, contractor disputes, or geopolitical disruption, it does not just become another delayed project, it becomes a symbol. There is a category of structure that historians call prestige ruins, buildings begun with extraordinary ambition, abandoned at some stage of construction, and left to stand as monuments to overreach. The Ryugyong Hotel in North Korea is the most famous example. Begun in 1987, it stands unfinished to this day, visible from most of Pyongyang, a daily reminder of what happens when ambition outruns execution. A half-built rise tower, visible from most of western Saudi Arabia, would carry that same weight. That is the risk Saudi Arabia is accepting. Both of those possibilities are interesting. Neither of them is comfortable. And the fact that they are accepting it tells you something. Either the people making this decision believe deeply in their own ability to execute, or they believe the announcement itself is worth the risk of failure. When the Rise Tower was announced, the global reaction split almost perfectly along predictable lines. Engineers called it fascinating, theoretically achievable, and extraordinarily difficult. Financial analysts called it ambitious with high execution risk. Geopolitical observers called it classic Saudi signaling and suggested appropriate skepticism. And the architecture world said the design is serious. The truth is probably all of those things at once. And the honest answer to whether the Rise Tower will exist in 2030 is that nobody, including the people who designed and funded it, knows with certainty. Before the outro, one question worth sitting with. If you could design one floor of a 2,000-meter tower, what would go on it? Drop your answer in the comments. The most creative ones we will read in a future video. Saudi Arabia is not just building a tower, it is making an argument. That the oil era is ending and a new era is beginning, and that the people who shape this next era will not be the ones still extracting resources from the ground. They will be the ones building things that touch the clouds. Whether the Rise Tower is completed on time, completed late, or ends up as one of history's great what-ifs, it has already done something no building still on paper has ever done. It has made the entire world look up. If you made it this far, you already know more about what Saudi Arabia is actually building than 90% of people who saw the headlines. Subscribe so you do not miss the follow-up when construction officially begins. And that video we mentioned earlier, covering the engineering race to build the world's most extreme structures, it is on screen right now.